Today is Thursday, October 16th, 2025, and I'm going to be doing something a little different today. I've done it before. I'll be reading from Richard Rohr's Daily Meditations and taking a Christian writer and talking about its impact on my thoughts towards our life today, not specifically from a Christian perspective, but how I guess the role religion plays in our lives or should play in our lives, and the impact of this particular meditation on my thoughts. So the devotion for today was entitled Prophetic Solidarity and Compassion, and it begins with Old Testament scripture scholar Walter Brueggemann, 1933 to 2025, witnesses Jesus' prophetic role in his solidarity and his compassion for those on the margins. And they are quoting from a couple of Walter Brueggemann's writings. And Brueggemann writes, among his other functions, it is clear that Jesus functioned as a prophet. In both his teaching and his very presence, Jesus of Nazareth presented the ultimate criticism of the royal empire consciousness. The way of his ultimate criticism is his decisive solidarity with marginal people and the accompanying vulnerability required by that solidarity. The only solidarity worth affirming is solidarity characterized by the same helplessness they know and experience. And then Rohr's group goes on. Jesus' prophetic actions were motivated by his deep solidarity and compassion for those who are suffering. And they quote again from Brueggemann. Jesus, in his solidarity with the marginal ones, is moved to compassion. Compassion constitutes a radical form of criticism, for it announces that the hurt is to be taken seriously, that the hurt is not to be accepted as normal and natural, but is an abnormal and unacceptable condition for humanness. In the arrangement of lawfulness in Jesus' time, as in the ancient empire of Pharaoh, the one unpermitted quality of relation was compassion. Empires are never built or maintained on the basis of compassion. The norms of law, social control, are never accommodated to persons, but persons are accommodated to the norms. Otherwise, the norms will collapse, and with them the whole power arrangement. Thus, the compassion of Jesus is to be understood not simply as a personal emotional reaction, but as a public criticism in which he dares to act upon his concern against the entire numbness of his social context. Empires live by numbness. Empires in their militarism expect numbness about the human cost of war. Corporate economies expect blindness to the cost in terms of poverty and exploitation. Governments and societies of domination go to great lengths to keep the numbness intact. Jesus penetrates the numbness by his compassion, and with his compassion takes the first step by making visible the odd abnormality that had become business as usual. Thus, compassion that might be seen simply as generous goodwill is in fact criticism of the system, forces, and ideologies that produce the hurt. Jesus enters into the hurt and finally comes to embody it. And then Rohr's writers go on to say, at the end of his book, The Tears of Things, Richard Rohr identifies characteristics of those he calls true prophets who follow in the footsteps of Jesus and the Hebrew prophets. Rohr writes, prophets embrace religion as a way of creating communities of solidarity with justice and suffering. They look for where the suffering is and go there, just as Jesus did. They speak of solidarity with one God, which also implies union with all else. The prophet learns to be for and with, not against. They are for those who are suffering or excluded. They are centered not on sin, but on growth, change, and life. They know that the best teachers are reality itself and creation. They do not reject the way of the priest. They have just moved beyond it alone. Well, a lot of this rings true for me, and one of my first impressions on reading this is that so much of what happens with all religions, if you look at the history of many of the major religions, or the founders of those, what became religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Judaism, Islam. A lot of the people at the beginnings of those were trying to highlight the issues with current life, the places where people have grown numb to the forces of empire, the way society has controlled people, not in a way to benefit the whole, but to benefit the few. And the empire itself then takes the rules of that particular faith tradition and bastardizes it, bends it towards control of the people, changing the focus from compassion and care for all people, for justice, for criticizing the systems of oppression, to controlling the people and maintaining power and control of the people. Every major religious tradition that I've seen has fallen, that I can see, has fallen prey to this, especially Christianity, especially now in the United States, with its overt Christianity, with its overt focus here in the U.S. on nationalism and focus on individual sin and saving people for their souls for the next life while ignoring the suffering that goes on in this world. And I think if you look hard, you don't even have to look hard. If you look at other major faith traditions, the same can be found in all of those traditions. Empire changes the focus of faith traditions so that the faith tradition can be used for control and subjugation rather than justice and compassion and care for all. And I think Richard Rohr really identifies the things he identifies as characteristics of true prophets really show what the intention was to draw people back to. That's what prophets did. The prophets were not foretelling the future, but trying to point out the shortfall, the shortcomings of the system, point out the things that are creating the numbness to get back to a community-centered way of living. And I think a lot of that stuff that Rohr wrote about really rings true to me in this world today. As he says, prophets really embrace religion as a way of creating communities of solidarity with justice and suffering. Go back and study the beginnings of all of the major faith traditions, and I think you'll find that. The other thing that Rohr wrote that rang especially true with me was speaking of solidarity with one God. Now, whether you believe there is a God or not, but I think the next part of that sentence, which also implies union with all else, is understanding our interconnectedness of life around us with all people, with all of creation. And that's what prophets should be pointing out, where we fail to recognize that interconnectedness. The other thing that really struck me, too, that Rohr said, is that prophets are centered not on sin, but on growth, change, and life. So it's a focus on this life and how we interact with one another and with creation, where empire has focused on individual sin and morality as they see it, to get people to focus not on this life, but on the next life. In other words, to cause people to get numb. Well, there's a whole much more I could unpack in this writing, but it would be too long, and I think I would probably lose most of your interest. But I encourage you to consider the words that I've spoken and read, to start looking at the world around you and the faith tradition that you're engaged with in a new way, and see where it's lacking in forming solidarity with justice and suffering that is occurring in the world. Hope it's given you something to think about, and hope to talk to you again soon.